A special thank you to today's sponsor, Private Internet Access VPN. It's someday in the future and your Tesla is driving you to work. You're sitting in the passenger seat and it's driving full self-driving version level 5, let's say. And there's a person who cuts you off right in front of you on the road. And of course your Tesla honks at it because everybody should honk if they get cut off, right? So the person in front of you then flips you off out the window. And you sit there and you think, man, road rage, that really sucks. But all of a sudden then your Tesla accelerates and smashes into the back of this car. Who's responsible for this? Hey y'all, it's Dr. Know-It-All. So I want to start off by being very, very clear here. I'm going to talk about legal stuff in this case, but it's going to be in the abstract. I have no legal training, I have no legal coursework or anything like that, no legal degrees or any of that stuff. So there are friends of mine, including Warren Redlick, who are, of course, much more, they're lawyers, so they actually know what the heck they're talking about. So I'm going to stay on the very, very high level here, and I'm going to base this on an article that was written about a decade ago by Gabriel Hallevy in the Syracuse Science and Technology Law Reporter. I'll leave a reference to it down below, but I can't really leave a link to it because it's an article, so you have to have permission to see it, right? Whatever. Anyway, so if you have a library thing, if you have a university library card, you can of course get it, but I'll leave a link to it down below, a reference to it. But anyway, so you can check it out if you want. But anyway, I just want to be really, really clear that I am not a lawyer. But, the minutia of law is really, really complicated, but at its most abstract level, it's actually relatively simple. So that's what we're going to stay at as a very, very high level. Anyway, now it's speculation time. And by the by, I actually have a shirt for that now. Some of my viewers seem very, very interested in that particular line and think it's a really kind of good catchphrase. So geez, I'll try not to overuse it. But anyway, Dan put a shirt in our merch store, so definitely check it out if you think it might be fun to have something like that. I'm going to order one myself. It's just hot off the press, so I haven't even had a chance to order one and get it in, but I'll wear it sometimes. In the meantime, I've got my Counting Crows shirt that I got from last Friday's concert, which was awesome. If you have a chance to see them, I highly recommend it. Okay, so first of all, let's just set the stage properly. So what I'm not arguing here is whether Tesla should be held legally liable, but should the cars themselves and eventually the Teslabots themselves be held liable? Or is that even possible? And that's actually exactly what Gabriel Hallevy's article talks about. It's not specific to cars or to robots, although it is kind of more, humanoid robots or something is what he's talking about. It's an extremely speculative article, of course, but he goes through some really, really interesting ways of thinking about this. And I'm reading it for class right now. And so I thought, hey, let's just kind of double up and let's talk about this on YouTube as well. So as viewers of the channel might know, I'm actually teaching a class right now on AI or robots and the way that we think about them. This is in a fictional context right now, and the movie that we're talking about this week is actually Ex Machina. If you haven't seen that movie, it's really quite good and very, very disturbing. But anyway, there's these legal aspects of what is an agent and what can actually be held criminally liable. So I thought this was a really cool thing to talk about. So anyway, I'm going to pull some quotes out of this article. I'm going to start with an interesting quote because it's a way of thinking about this. Criminal law has a very important social function, that of preserving social order for the benefit and welfare of society. By law, corporations are treated as, quote, people or legally liable agents with, quote, intent and, quote, action capabilities. And I think Hallevy's argument here really kind of hinges on the fact that corporations are already treated as liable agents, right? So they can have intent and action even though they don't have a, quote, soul. In other words, they're not a person. They can have these things and they can be held to a standard like a regular normal human being would be held to. So that of course raises the question of whether a robot could be considered something between a person and a corporation. In other words, it looks like a single entity, but its creation was sort of done in a corporate fashion. So anyway, continuing on with the article, he says, there are 5 attributes one would expect an intelligent entity to have. 1, communication. In other words, one can communicate with an intelligent entity. The easier it is to communicate with that entity, the more intelligent the entity seems. 2, mental knowledge. An intelligent entity is expected to have some knowledge about itself. 3, external knowledge. An intelligent entity is expected to know about the outside world, to learn about it, and to utilize that information. 4, goal-driven behavior. An intelligent entity is expected to take action in order to achieve its goals. And 5, creativity. An intelligent entity is expected to have some degree of creativity. In this context, creativity means the ability to take alternate action when the initial action fails. So that last point on point number 5 is actually important. We're not talking about like being an artist or something, right? It's in a car context, and cars are robots. I've argued that. You can check out my episodes about that before. And Elon Musk says that as well as me. It's not just me. But anyway, in the context of a car, and we've seen this recently with the full self-driving betas, if the car navigates and it says, I need to make a left turn here for my navigation route planning, right? But it's stuck in the right lane and there are cars in the way and it can't get through. It takes a creative solution, which is it goes through the light and it goes up to the next light and takes a left there, right? So that is a creative solution. It's not painting a painting or composing music. It's just making a creative solution to a problem that's rather intractable at the time, rather than just stopping in the middle of the road, right? That's what a dumb car would do, or a dumb human being would do, is they just stop in the middle of the road and just go like, oh no, I don't know what to do, right? So an intelligent agent needs to be able to handle failure. And again, I've talked about that, graceful failure, if you want to catch that episode. But it's important that cars be able to do that. They have to be able to fail gracefully in order to drive without a human being intervening. So those, according to Hallevy, are the 5 aspects of an intelligent agent. And I think there are pretty reasonable arguments for that. So then we get to the question of what criminal liability is. And basically it means you have to have the ability to act and you have to have the mental capacity to understand what you're doing. So here, quoting again from the article, in order to impose criminal liability upon a person, 2 main elements must exist. The first is the factual element, i.e. criminal conduct, actus reus in Latin, while the other is the mental element, i.e. knowledge or general intent in relation to the conduct element, mens rea. If one of them is missing, no criminal liability can be imposed. Hallevy then goes on to give us an example of something that would not be criminally liable. A parrot is capable of repeating words it hears, but it is incapable of formulating the mens rea required for libel. So again, in other words, there needs to be the physical capacity to do something in the world, which is what differentiates a robot from a computer, right? A computer could have all the bad intent it wanted, but as long as it wasn't connected to the internet or something, it has no real way of affecting the outside world. Whereas a robot, even something as, simple as one of those industrial robots that just moves around and like places things, in a factory, that has the capability of interacting with the real world. So the physical aspect of it is a relatively straightforward thing, right? If you can move an arm or turn your wheels or accelerate or brake or something like that, you have the ability to act on the world. The real question comes down to the mental aspect, or the, criminal intent or non-intent or negligence or whatever you want to call it. That's the big question. And of course you have to remember, any physical object could contain the element of action. So, even something like a frying pan that's up on a high shelf in a store and something knocks it or something like that and it falls on somebody's head and injures that person. That frying pan had the ability to act, but of course had no intention because it's a frying pan. It's a piece of metal. So it had no, criminal liability, because it would be like, suing the frying pan in court. That would be ridiculous. What you would do is you would sue the store for negligence for placing the frying pan in an unsafe manner on a high shelf where it could potentially fall and hurt someone. And of course, then the legal arguments go back and forth whether that's actually the case. But that would be the case that you would put against the store as opposed to against the frying pan. So it seems kind of stupid when you say it that way, but you can have cars, right? If you drive a car right now, a car is dumb. It's like a frying pan. And I'm even talking about ones with ADAS and all of that kind of stuff in them. They're still dumb. So basically the person who's driving right now is the responsible party. And that, of course, is why we have insurance. And that's why you get taken to court if you rear end somebody, right? In the case that I talked about, the hypothetical at the beginning, if you're driving the car and somebody cuts you off and you honk and they flip you off and you get mad and you rear end that person, that's your fault. And of course you could make an argument in court that that person enticed you into it or something like that, but you're gonna lose. It's gonna be your fault because you rear ended the other car. So again, when we're talking about robots here, the real question is element 2, or the mens rea, or alternatively the criminal intent, if you like. So Hallevy then goes into 3 potential ways in which liability could be associated with a robotic entity like a car. And again, in his article, he never talks about cars. He only talks about, nebulous but quasi-humanoid robots. But cars are robots, so we're going to take that and run with it. So his case A is the perpetration by another liability model. His case B is the natural probable consequences liability model, and his case C is the direct liability model. So case A is an innocent agent, in other words, something like a hammer. So the person who causes something to happen with a hammer is the responsible party and is liable in such cases. And as Hallevy says, the intermediary is regarded as a mere instrument, albeit a sophisticated instrument, while the party orchestrating the offense, the perpetrator by another, is the real perpetrator. So again, this would be like a dumb car or a hammer or something like that. If you're driving, a 1995 Toyota Corolla and you smash into something, that's your fault, right? The car has no ability to understand the universe around it. So that's pretty straightforward. So case A is not particularly interesting to us. His case B is natural probable consequences, or in other words, programmer or user negligence. Again, quoting from Hallevy's article, for instance, one scenario would be when an AI robot commits an offense during the execution of its daily tasks. The programmers or users had no knowledge of the offense until it had already been committed. They did not plan to commit any offense, and they did not participate in any part of the commission of that specific offense. So here again, there's no intent, but there is a criminal action that has taken place. And that's why we have things like negligence laws, right? So it's like you reasonably could have foreseen that something could go wrong, so it's your fault, right? That's the basic crux of the argument. And again, the minutia of whether you're legally liable or not is a very, very tangled web, but that's the basic question at heart. Interesting, Hallevy argues that the original natural probable consequences liability was used to impose criminal liability on accomplices. And again, quoting from the article, the natural probable consequence liability model only requires the programmer or user to be in a mental state of negligence, not more, since the specific offense is a natural probable consequence of that person's conduct. Negligence is, in fact, an omission of awareness or knowledge. So here again, we're just talking about the consequence of being ignorant, I guess. You should have known is the basic question here. And when you get to this type of car like a Tesla is right now, it becomes kind of interesting who's at fault. I don't know that anybody has actually sued Tesla after an accident or something, but let's say that I was driving the ADAS system and I know that you've already signed off and said it's my responsibility, and every time it comes on it says it's your responsibility. But I could certainly see somebody taking Tesla to court and saying, I'm driving down the highway, the car says that it's functional, right? And you should have known that under this specific set of circumstances, the car was going to rear end an ambulance or a car in front of it, or it was going to swerve out of the way and smash into a bunch of construction cones or something along those lines, right? So I could see that argument being made. So here again, the car itself, the robot, is not liable, but the question becomes whether I as the driver am liable or the company is liable. So anyway, interesting questions, and it's something that's probably going to come up in the near future. But again, this is not the most interesting question. Hey y'all, I'd like to take a minute to talk to you about Private Internet Access VPN, which is the sponsor for today's video. A VPN is all about privacy, security, and freedom, and Private Internet Access VPN is the best at all of these. If you don't want government entities or commercial entities snooping around your stuff, then you definitely want VPN, and PIA VPN is the best at this. They use open source software, so that means that everything's being examined by the open source community constantly, and so their security is at the very top of the game. You also want security for your data and for your browsing history. And Private Internet Access VPN never uses logs. They don't keep any logs of your access or anything that you've done, and this has been held up in court, so that's amazing. And finally, we all want freedom. We want to be able to access data when we want it and where we want it. And Private Internet Access VPN gives you access to VPN servers all around the globe. So you can basically be in Canada or Europe or South Korea or anywhere else you'd like to be, all while using Private Internet Access VPN. And this gives you the ability to download content that you might not be able to get in your own home territory, and that's amazing. So with the best privacy through open source software, the best security, and the best freedom to access content anywhere you want, anytime you want, Private Internet Access VPN is the best. Check out the link in the description and see how you can save up to 83%. Heck, it ends up being less than a cup of coffee per month to protect your privacy, your security, and your freedom. What could be better? So what is the most interesting question? Well, of course, it's option C, which is direct liability, in other words, criminal agency. So again, quoting from the article, The relevant questions regarding the criminal liability of AI robots are, how can these robots fulfill the requirements of criminal liability? Do AI robots differ from humans in this context? And continuing on, if an AI robot is capable of fulfilling the requirements of both the factual element and the mental element, and in fact it actually fulfills them, there is presumptively nothing to prevent criminal liability from being imposed on that AI robot. So let's just take a step back here. So again, my hypothetical was that somebody cuts off the car honks, which is, let's say, an emotional reaction, right? That's what a human being might do. Then the person flips off, right? Reaches out and flips off the car, and then the car escalates and accelerates into the back of the car in front of it. Those actions, the honking and then the escalation to rear-ending the car in front of it, those are what I would consider to be human agency type of actions, right? So if the car gets to the point where it's making decisions and it's actively, as an agent, deciding what to do next rather than just following a recipe, right? So traditional programming is kind of recipe, right? It's like, if this, then do this, if this, then do this. But now what we've got is we've got neural networks and we've got things that are being trained in the real world, and they can certainly learn to do things that we might not consider to be good things, right? So I'm sure Tesla is working very hard to make sure this doesn't happen. But one example of this was the AI agent that Microsoft introduced into the wild. And it was supposed to learn from tweets and other types of social media how to interact with the world. Well, it very rapidly turned into sort of a racist right-wing conspiracy theory, bot, and they had to take it offline. So that's the kind of thing that can happen, and that's unintentional. And, in the world of virtual stuff, it doesn't do that much harm. But if your car ends up learning something like that, right? If it goes off the rails and it decides to be aggressive and to hit something else, can that car specifically be held liable for the actions that it did? And again, just to sort of specify this whole thing, continuing on in Hallevy's article, he says, knowledge is defined as a sensory reception of factual data and the understanding of that data. The specific intent required to establish liability for murder is a purpose or an aim that a certain person will die. And again, back to our hypothetical case here, we're not talking about murder specifically, but the idea of causing harm to the car in front of you and potentially injury to the people in that car as well. And here Hallevy kind of dissociates feelings from actual criminal intent liability. However, these feelings are rarely required in specific offenses. Most specific offenses are satisfied by knowledge of the existence of the factual element. Few offenses require specific intent in addition to knowledge. Almost all other offenses are satisfied by much less than that, e.g. negligence, recklessness, strict liability. Continuing on, if a person fulfills the requirements of both the factual element and the mental element of a specific offense, then the person is held criminally liable. Why should an AI robot that fulfills all elements of an offense be exempt from criminal liability? And there's the crux of the issue. If we can prove that there is intent in a robot, in other words, that it has the agency to make a decision to act on the world that is outside of very, very strict programming guidelines, right? If that's the case, then we can actually assign liability to that robot. And as I said before, working in the AI field, neural networks and other types of machine learning, cutting edge machine learning types of technology are such that this actually is beginning to happen. These things are not necessarily completely predictable in what they're going to do. And that starts to give agency to the actual, mind of these robots. And that really does start to bring up the very, very interesting aspect of like, okay, this robot could actually be guilty of a crime. But of course, also the robot then needs to have enough agency to know right from wrong. And that's an interesting aspect too. It's more likely that the initial cases will probably be more of negligence, right? It'll be something where it's not as likely that the robot actually intended to do harm, but was being negligent in its actions and caused harm. So my hypothetical case of it having road rage is a pretty extended version of this. More likely it would be something where it just sort of failed, and it failed in a way that wasn't, tied, well, at least not solely to the company itself, but partially to the robot also. Of course, Hallevy also talks about criminal defense aspects and things like that, like self-defense and other things. So it's really kind of interesting, and it really gets into the weeds. So I highly recommend reading the article. But the last thing I want to talk about briefly is punitive aspects. So let's say we have a car or a Teslabot that's an agent and it does a crime. what in the world do you do with this thing? It's kind of difficult to imagine finding this, which is a very, that's something that you would normally do to human beings. It's like you have to pay $10,000 or $100,000 to pay off this thing. But the car itself has no money, or the Teslabot has no money. So what do you do about that? Another possibility, of course, is imprisonment. And I guess you could imagine imprisoning a robot. It would be a kind of a bizarre thing to have a car behind bars, but there you go. But you could at least turn it off, right? And leave it in the scrapyard or something and just like say like, well, you're going to stay there for 5 years because that's what you deserve because you did this. And then of course, the worst case scenario is if it did something really bad, like intentional murder or something, you could actually terminate it, which would mean sort of wiping its memory. And of course, with a human being, terminating a human being is a pretty that's it. That's the worst case scenario. You've ended that person's life. But with a robot, it's like, well, if this shares a consciousness, let's say there's 10 million cars with this full self-driving, capability in them, and one car is found legally responsible. Well, you wipe that car, but is there an actual individuality to that car, or are there 10 million more copies? And also, by sort of accomplice law, would all of these other cars potentially be criminally liable as well to a lesser extent? These are all, bizarre questions. But anyway, that's why I said it was very speculative about this. So establishing that a robot, a car or a Teslabot or something like that, has criminal intent is going to be a rather challenging thing to do. Certainly negligence will be a much lower bar and will be much easier, and probably an initial case is probably going to end up revolving around negligence. But in any case, if it's found guilty, the punishment, the punitive aspects of our law seem wholly inadequate to punishing a robot. So that will be a really interesting thing too, right? So if something like that, if a Teslabot is found guilty, what happens to it? What can you do to punish this Teslabot that is an effective mode of punishment? All of this is really interesting, and you may think this is a long way in the future, but I think it actually is only a year or two or maybe 5 into the future. So we'll see what happens in the near future. All right, I hope you found this episode fun and thought-provoking. If you did, definitely like it so other people can find it. And of course, consider subscribing for more of this. As always, a huge shout out to my patrons on Patreon. Thank you all so much for your support. I really do appreciate it. And of course, if you want to join the club, definitely check out the link in the description. And if you're interested in some awesome merch, check out the link in the description. We've got the Teslabot t-shirt, which is super popular these days. Don't mess with Tesla. Lots of other t-shirts, tumblers, mugs, etc. So check out the link in the description and help the channel out. And as always, feel free to ask me questions in the comments or at my email address, which is drknowitallknows@gmail.com. Till next time, bye-bye.